So the trail actually started as a freight trail from Missouri down to Santa Fe, Mexico, and it was in 1821. So that freight system was going for quite a while before Kansas was open to pioneering. In 1854 it was open for homesteading, and there were a few people looking around prior to 1854, but nobody was settling here. It was all Indian territory. But in 1854 it was open for settling and homesteading. And so the first area of significance in this location was Palmyra. And there was a well there, and fairly quickly there were a hotel, a saloon, two blacksmiths, and a wagon shop. Those are the shops that I know of. There was a grocery store and a post office, and they became established within a year after 1854. So by 1855 it was established. There was a lot of traffic coming on the trail that used those areas, and the next one to the west would have been Brooklyn, the one to the east would have been Blackjack. And so they were about 6-8 miles apart. So fairly quickly after Palmyra became established, the founders of the town were very, very interested in getting a college established. And they were Methodists, and most of the people in the area, for whatever reason, were Methodists. So there was quite an effort to try to establish a Methodist college. There were several different proposals. The one by the Bear Claws and Abraham Still, and I've forgotten some of the other names, but they were the leaders of the group anyway. Their proposal was to start Baker University. It was named after a bishop with the Methodist Church in the area.
So the history is strongly religious in this area?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And they were going to purchase a full section, 640 acres, and the idea was that 640 acres would be deeded to the university, and then they would sell those lots to come up with the funding for the university. And their idea was that the university would not be actually on Palmyra. At first they were going to put it somewhere between Palmyra and what we call Signal Oak, so it would have been to the north,
Okay.
a little bit up the hill, but instead the land that they ended up buying was essentially to the south and west of Palmyra. And so that property, as it was sold, was basically establishing Baldwin City. And the people that were in Palmyra, they knew that that was going to establish a new city. And it wasn't like they had this ownership of Palmyra that they didn't want to give it up or anything. They basically were sacrificing everything they had to establish Baker University and to fund it to establish Baldwin City around it.
And that's very unusual, isn't it?
Yes, right. And they were giving the 640 acres themselves out of their own pocket, purchasing it.
So the town of Palmyra was essentially right on the Santa Fe Trail, correct?
Yes.
And Baker was not on the trail.
Right. The Baker, if you look at Parmenter or Old Castle, that's not quite a half mile, between a quarter and a half mile from Palmyra. So it was a little bit off-site. It was the highest ground around south of Palmyra, so that was one of the reasons. Baldwin kind of has a ridge down the middle with a creek on both sides, and the campus was right on that highest point.
So the geography of this entire area had a lot to do with the trail coming through here in the first place, right?
Yes, there was an area, what they called the Narrows, which actually started at the town of Blackjack and wound all the way out to Simmons Point, which is essentially the end of it. And what the Narrows meant was that the drainage to the north went to the Kansas River, the drainage to the south went to the Meridocene, and if they stayed on that ridge, that meant they didn't have to go through creeks, and those were the most difficult areas to get through because wagons. It'd take a lot of work. They'd most likely break the wagons down if going through creeks.
And that brings us to wagons. Can you talk about the wagons and the teams that pulled them a little bit? It was essentially, I mean, the Santa Fe Trail was essentially moving goods, not people, right?
Right. The wagons that they used were much taller sides. They were more sturdily built. The wheels were much wider and heavier, so they were carrying sometimes as much as 5 or 6 or 7,000 pounds of goods in those wagons. So they were much bigger and heavier built. The canvas on the top was not as high because it wasn't like people living in them, whereas the Canastota wagons that went on the Oregon and California Trail, they were more dwellings on the move. So people would stand up in those and so on. But the cargo freight wagons weren't that way. And they were pulled more by horses and mules. Mules probably more than anything. They were longer lasting than horses. They were faster than oxen. The oxen were hardier, they could pull more weight, but they were much slower. And so that's why they chose mules quite often.
That makes sense.
So people would quite often use oxen because they were essentially cows or steers. And so when they got to the place, then that would be their livestock, essentially.
So in the area that is now Baldwin City, there are multiple small towns, right? There's Palmyra, which is now part of Baldwin City. What other towns were part of Baldwin City?
Media is where the current depot is.
Okay.
And it became established because of a little town called Prairie City. Now, Prairie City is just outside of Baldwin. Very little of it ever became annexed into Baldwin. So it kind of remained separate, but it's not really, there's just a cluster of houses there. But Prairie City had a depot, and Baldwin had a depot, and the first depot was on the end of Elm Street where it hits the railroad. And the railroad company didn't want to maintain 2 depots. There wasn't enough business to keep 2 depots in business. So they decided to build one in between, and that's where Media came about. So that second depot in Baldwin was actually where the grain elevator is on the west side of the tracks. And then the third depot is the current one, the brick one. So it was built in 1906. I should back up for a second and say that the town of Baldwin was named after John Baldwin. And he came from Ohio.
I meant to ask you about that.
He was a fairly wealthy man. He was also very frugal, and that's how he became wealthy. The idea, he had established Berea College and established Baldwin College in Ohio, and then later on he established another college in Louisiana and several schools in Africa. So he was very interested in establishing schools. People knew that. He was actually a Mormon. So he wasn't related to the Methodist College, but they thought he would be willing to help them establish Baker University. So they told him, well, if you come here and help us get this established, we'll name the new town after you.
That's an interesting intersection.
Yes. He came, but his business basically turned out to be a failure. And he had the idea that he would eventually contribute $10,000 to establish the school. That never really materialized. Part of the failure was that his son came. He was going to be headmaster, I think would be the term, because it was not, he was going to be headmaster of the preparatory school, not the university, and he died about 2 weeks before the school was to start. And that was a real blow to John Baldwin. And so he left. He went back to Ohio. He tried to keep his business, which was a sawmill and grinding mill, tried to keep that established long distance, but unfortunately he really didn't have people that knew what they were doing, and so they kept trying, but they basically ran the company into the ground.
Well,
literally. It just went into the creek.
I've heard that there could potentially still be visible remains of that mill. Is that true?
There supposedly is very large grindstone that disappeared. No one knows where it went, and my theory is that it's probably still in the mud down there. There was probably after the mill deteriorated and wasn't being used anymore, it fell apart. Grindstones are heavy,
Right.
and if there was a flood, it's quite likely that grindstone just sank into the mud.
So what would be the significance of him founding a mill? How would that have helped the town start?
Well, as a grindstone, I mean a grind mill, you can grow wheat or oats or barley or corn, but if you don't have any way of grinding it, you don't have a useful product as such, because people are not going to grind that themselves. So there was great value in having a grinding mill right there, so you didn't have to ship it off somewhere else and then bring the flour back,
Right.
or the cornmeal. So there was a great value in that, and there was good business, but they just could not seem to keep the mill running. The creek was the source of water. A lot of people think of mills being a water wheel type thing, but this was just a steam engine run mill. The steam was the power to turn the mill or the saw, and they had problems with water. They had a severe drought in 1860, 1861.
Which is the story of the American prairies, right?
Yeah, and it ran most of the early pioneers off. A lot of them left or even starved to death.
Yeah.
So the main railroad was on the north side of the Kansas River, what is the Union Pacific now. I don't recall what the name was then. But anyway, that was the main railroad, and there really wasn't any railroad south of the Kansas River. So they came up with the idea of having a railroad going from Lawrence south and eventually connecting to Galveston, Texas. So it was called the Lawrence Leavenworth Galveston Railroad. I
That's
don't
a
know
mouthful.
about. Pardon?
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, and I don't remember too much about the connection from Lawrence to Leavenworth. That seemed to, I don't know that it ever really materialized. I think they used what is now the Union Pacific to get goods to Lawrence. Then the big problem was getting across the river. And they built the entire railroad from Baldwin to Ottawa without a bridge. And they had to bring the locomotives across basically on barges.
Wow.
So they had a floating bridge. To me, it's incredible. They had one that was substantial enough to load railroad cars across it. But anyway, that's what they did to bring all the materials. So they got the railroad built to Ottawa, and shortly after that, the current ATSF, Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad that goes south of Baldwin, that became established. So they connected to it and went into Kansas City that way, rather than relying on a railroad bridge across Lawrence. So it never really connected very effectively to the north side of Lawrence. By the time they got the railroad built, it connected to Atchison, Topeka.
So what is the timeline for the founding of the railroad? The Santa Fe Trail.
Yeah, the trail started in 1821, homesteaded in 1854. The railroad was built between Lawrence and Ottawa and connected, I'm going to say January 1st, 1867. I think that was the year, 1867. So.
And the town of Baldwin City was incorporated sometime in 1870.
That's the date we have. It's possible that it actually was established as a town when the post office was moved to Baldwin, and that actually happened in 1857.
Oh, wow.
So there's some question exactly when Baldwin, and back then it wasn't as well established as to what the criteria would be for it to become incorporated. So it's kind of a loose history there, I guess I would say.
Understood.
But a lot of the times when the railroads were built, they basically did away with the trails. Now,
Right.
That wasn't necessarily the case here, because even though more and more people were using the railroad through Baldwin, that wasn't a freight line as such. It was more passengers. And so the traffic to Santa Fe was still going on the Santa Fe Trail. Now, as the railroads became established, they tended to move the goods down the what is now the Union Pacific to Manhattan, and then take a trail south from there as the railroads expanded out there. So there was less freight traffic after 1870 in Baldwin, but that the road as such was still there, and it was still used quite extensively, probably up even into the 1900s.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
And actually quite a lot of the highway is similar.
Well, there's just small segments of it now that follow the actual route. The angled part from Blackjack Park into Baldwin basically goes very close to the trail, and in several places that it crosses it. But that road is not on the ridge, and the wagons were staying up on the ridge, so they were within sight of where the highway is, but they weren't actually where the highway is.
So you're part of a historical society here in town,
Mm-hmm.
and part of your focus is the trail routes out at Blackjack.
Yes.
Right? Can you talk about that for a little bit, and also the association?
How we became established in 1967, the Santa Fe Trail Historical Society, and the impetus of getting the organization going was a marker out north of town at what's called Trail Park. It's one of the largest granite markers that was established by Daughters of the American Revolution along the Santa Fe Trail. I believe they have 90 some markers. This one was a much larger one. I think there's 3 of them this size on the trail. Most of them are probably 1/4 as big. It also had a bronze plaque on it showing wagon train. And the bronze plaque was stolen. And that infuriated some local historians, and they wanted to try to reestablish it. Well, getting a bronze plaque reconstructed and put back on that monument was going to be very, very expensive. So instead, there's a granite marker, or a granite motif of the marker that was put on that marker. But that's what established the organization, and it was called Santa Fe Trail Historical Society because a lot of the history of this area related to the Santa Fe Trail. Now, there's other things going on, but most of the history is really related to the Santa Fe Trail or related to pioneers that came here on the Santa Fe Trail.
Right.
It wasn't basically people coming in by railroad.
Right.
So that's where the history started, and that's why we're named that. Now, in I think it was 1984, 85, the Santa Fe Trail was established as a National Historic Trail. And so shortly after that, I believe in 1986, they established the Santa Fe Trail Association. So the Santa Fe Trail Association has chapters along the Santa Fe Trail. We are also one of those chapters. We call ourselves the Douglas County chapter of the Santa Fe Trail Association.
So there's an awful lot of Santa Fe Trail going on.
Yes, and it's confusing because none of the other chapters along the trail have a name that includes Santa Fe Trail. They're all like Missouri River Outfitters is the one in Kansas City. The one in Council Bluffs is called Flint Hills Chapter. So they don't have the confusing names that we do. But we were established 20 years earlier, and so we just keep both names. Same organization.
Right. So also there's a Santa Fe Depot, which isn't on the Santa Fe Trail.
Right. How did it get its name? I suspect that was more the railroad, and by then it was built by Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad.
So the Santa Fe was part of the railroad's name.
Yeah. That railroad basically went to Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Right.
And because our town was probably more closely associated with the trail than many of the other locations, I'm guessing that that's how the name was applied to it. But it was from their standpoint, it was a pretty fancy depot. And most of the depots that were brick, and the style of this one, were in much, much larger towns. But because Baker University used it for their students coming into town, they went ahead and built a fairly nice, fancy depot.
So it was in honor of Baker, essentially.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. And unfortunately, the mile route from the depot to town wasn't very well established early on. It was buckboards, and later on a bus that was open air and roll down tarp windows.
And not to get too far afield, but isn't that the Women's Bridge came into being because of?
Yes, because it was just a
that
creek bottom, and the wagons had to get the kids here, and they went right through that creek bed as well. So yeah, it took a while to get that bridge built. So the history of the depot is that the last freight usage was in the 1950s, and so the depot basically was shut down about that time. The last train that I'm aware of was when I was a senior in high school during Maple Leaf Festival. They ran a passenger train from Baldwin to Lawrence and back, and I think that was the actual last train that ever went on the tracks.
Wow. Were you on that?
Mm-hmm. Yep, I vividly remember parts of it hanging out the window. But anyway, so after that would have been, that would have been 1965, I believe. We can look back in Maple Leaf records and find that out probably. But anyway, that was the last that depot was used, and it had been vandalized. After that, the windows were broken out, the roof was in bad repair by then, so it was leaking. And by 1967, it was in pretty bad shape, and weeds growing up around it, because the the railroad was no longer tending it or anything. And one of our members, Richard Allen, noticed, he was out at the depot, and he noticed some gentlemen over there pulling up the bricks around the depot. So he went over to ask them what was going on, and they said, well, the railroad is getting ready to tear down the depot. And to them it was a liability. So his wife was the chairman of the Bicentennial Committee, which had just finished their mission, 1976. But they contacted the railroad, new people with the railroad, and he was able to get them to not go ahead with their plans of tearing it down. And then they worked on trying to get the deed transferred to the Santa Fe Trail Historical Society, but for whatever reasons, they could only transfer it to a government entity. So the city accepted the deed of the property, and that included both the depot and what we now call Allen Park. The Allen Park was not actually named after Richard Allen. It would have been fitting to do that, but there was another gentleman that donated a large sum of money to put up the stone walls and establish playground area and so on that was named Allen. So the Santa Fe Trail Historical Society, even though they did not own the depot, they were basically the entity that raised all the funds to restore the building to what it is today. And the whole idea at that time was to develop it into a community center. The president, Phil Barnhouse, was very interested in trains and trying to reestablish a tourist train in Baldwin. And so he was able to work with Midland, and they came to Baldwin in 1987. And I don't recall when the Kansas Bell Dinner Train came. I think it was in the 90s. So it was much later after Midland. But that's kind of the history of it.
Wow. So that's an awful lot of history for one little town.
So far, yes.
So far, good point. So this year we're celebrating the 150th anniversary, and as you pointed out, who knows when Baldwin City actually started in any meaningful sense. But you can celebrate at any point, no matter
Yes.
what.
Right.
So we really appreciate you sitting down and talking to us.
Mm-hmm.
And is there anything else that you'd like to end with?
We're working on a new pedestrian trail at the Ruts at Blackjack, 3 miles out.
Oh,
So
awesome.
that's something to look forward to. It's always been a very difficult access, and so we're making it ADA accessible to the first rut, and then we're building a better foot trail out to the other ruts that people can hike.
And
to.
those ruts are said to be the best preserved on the trail, right?
And the other part of it is public land. So many of the ruts are on private land that people can't visit. So they're public and they're extremely visible once you get out to them. So that's a couple of pluses.
So those ruts are more than 150 years old.
Right, let's see my math here. Well, they're all 200 years next year.
Right. So they would have started being developed in 200 years ago.
Yeah, it's a 200-year bicentennial of the trail next year, and that's one of the reasons why we're doing the trail this year. We're going to have a big dedication next year.
Wow. Well, thanks for talking to us, Patrick.
You bet. Thank you.